Greetings everyone, and welcome to this video on using the add-on Mask Tools. Now, if you don't know what Mask Tools is, it's an add-on that speeds up and simplifies the process of texturing in Blender. Version 1.4 was just released, and it has tons of new features and improvements. As always, it's a huge help to me if you guys like the video and share it with other Blender artists, and it's greatly appreciated. Like I said before, there are lots of new features in version 1.4, but we won't really get to talk about those today. In this video tutorial, we're going to be focusing mostly on the core basic functionality of the add-on, which is painting separate materials and then baking out all of those individual texture maps to be applied to our models. And while I will cover a few of the new features in this video, I will make another more thorough video in the very near future detailing what all of these new features and changes are. But most of the procedural nodes are greatly improved, and in fact nearly every node has seen some kind of improvement. In this example, I'm going to take this simple cube, which is just scaled slightly on the x-axis, and I'm going to change it into this antique decorative wooden box. So the first thing that I'll do is I will split my screen and open up the shader editor so that I can work with the material nodes. And by default we have the principled shader, and after you install the add-on, you'll see here on the sidebar you have this new tab called Mask Tools. By default it's set to Mask Base, but I'm going to select the preset option and then click Add Shader. And this adds several mask base nodes that are all connected up, but I'm going to delete half of these and just leave the final two. The preset option also has the normal map node and the bump node already set up, which will save a little bit of time. Now before I connect all of these inputs into the principled shader, I'm going to switch over to rendered view, and I am using the Eevee render engine. And you can see here I'm also using an HDRI to light the world background. So now I'll start connecting some of these outputs to their corresponding inputs on the principled shader. I'll connect the color, the metallic, the roughness, and the normal and bump are already connected, so I'll just plug the normal into the normal input. Now I have a basic dielectric material with a very mid-range value for the roughness. The first step is to add a set of PBR textures to this first set of inputs on the mask base node. And I'll start with this wood plank texture. I'll plug the albedo texture into the color input. Next I have a roughness texture. So I'll set this to non-color data and plug this into the roughness input. And I'm skipping over the metallic input because I don't have a metallic texture for this set of PBR textures. Next I'll add the normal map and set this to non-color data as well, and add that to the normal input. I'll just make a little bit of room here because we're going to add one more texture. And that is the height map, or the displacement texture. So once again I'll set this to non-color data and plug that into the displacement input. Now these planks look a little too large, so I'm going to scale them with a mapping node. So you can add a mapping node if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. You can just select a node and type Ctrl-T, and that adds the mapping node for you. So okay, I scaled this a little on the X and Y axis, and I think that looks a lot better. And because I like to keep everything organized in the shader editor, I'm going to box select all of these nodes and type Ctrl-G, which adds these into a node group. And you can even rename these if you want. I can just call this wood. But again, just helps make everything a little more organized. Now we have the second set of PBR texture input, so we can add another set. And for this I'm going to add this old worn paint texture. So again, the albedo into the color, and then all of the other maps into their corresponding inputs as well. Just remember to switch all of your any texture that's not providing color information should be set to non-color data. Now I'll use Ctrl-G again to pack this into a node group, and I'll just rename this paint. And you may notice that I didn't use a height map for this set of PBR textures, and I'll discuss that later once I get to the step when we work with displacement. But for now I need a mask to separate these two sets of PBR textures. So I'll type Shift-A and add an image texture. I'll first click the New tab and I'll rename this wood_paint. And I'll keep the resolution at 1024 by 1024 and keep the background color black. Then I'll plug this into the mask input. And before I go into my texture paint settings, I'm going to add a custom brush. So in the properties window, if I scroll all the way down to the textures tab, I can click on it and then add a new texture and then click open. And Mask Tools, of course, comes with all of these custom brushes. And I'll just choose a very generic noisy brush. So I'll use maybe this brush 3, click open image. And now I'll go to my texture paint settings and I'll go into rendered view and then disable the overlays. And before I start painting, I want to make sure that all of my settings are correct. So first, make sure that you're painting on the right texture. Next, make sure that you're painting in a value of pure white. And here in this texture dropdown, Blender doesn't really display PNG images very well, but the texture is there. I do want to switch the mapping from tiled to view plane. And then I'm going to click this random checkbox. So what that does is it will randomly rotate the texture as you're painting. But you can see that these edges look very soft, and that's because of the fall off for this brush. By default, it's set to have a bit of a gradient along the edge. So if I select this last fall off, it has a much harder edge, which just displays the whole texture within the brush, and it gives a nicer result. So now I'm just very quickly adding some of this paint texture all around the surface of the cube, not being especially careful about its placement. In fact, I'm intentionally leaving some areas unaffected by the paint. Okay, so I think that this will do well for this demonstration. So what I want to do is split the image editor and I'll open the shader editor so that we can look at some of the settings on the mask-based node. So we'll come over to this one that has all of these textures plugged in. And directly under the mask input, you'll see some erase mask settings, which we're going to be using these in just a few moments. The next thing is the mask blend. And while there isn't a very good purpose for this right now, what you can see is that it's affecting the contrast of the mask. This too we'll be using in a little while. Next we have the normal blend, and what this does is just blends between the normal maps. So if I slide this all the way up, you can see that the wood cracks are coming through that paint. But I want to pull it back some because I want to make sure that I still have some of the normal map information from the paint texture as well. Now we have color blend, which just uses the lightest values of that paint texture. So it still shows all of the wood detail underneath. We can also choose to darken that with the slider just below it. But this is only using the albedo information. You can see here there's still a difference in the roughness and the normal information. But in this example, I'm not going to use either one of those. So I'll just slide these back down. Next we have the add mask value, which we will be using in a little while. The contrast overlay, however, I will use. And what this does is it removes the darkest values of that wood texture from the mask. And you can invert this as well if you, say, wanted to paint something within the cracks of the wood. But I don't want to do that in this case. I will use the adjust overlay settings to affect just how that painted worn wood looks. I think that looks okay, so maybe I'll just paint a little more over here and we can move on to the next steps. So under the contrast overlay we have these bump settings. You can see if I drag this up it looks pretty hideous. So because this is just paint on wood, it would naturally have a very low bump value. So I'm going to do something very small, maybe like a 0.005. And that gives just a slight bit of height information and makes it look a little nicer. So something that's important to remember about masks in general is that you can think of them as visual interpretations of a mathematical value. So what I mean by this is, let me just add a texture. So I'll add a procedural texture, this Musgrave texture. And before we looked at this color blend option. So if I slide this all the way up to a value of 1, you can see that it lightens the effect. And because a Musgrave texture has values of black and white, if we plug that into the color blend input, the values of black won't affect that mask at all, while the colors of white will then lighten them. So it's just a really important thing to remember that almost anything in Blender that has a value can be affected by a mask with values of black and white. And this gives you an even larger variety of ways in which you can customize the look of these effects. Okay, so now I'm going to come back up to these erase mask settings and I'm going to demonstrate how they can be used. First, I'll duplicate the image texture with Shift D and I'll open a new texture. And of all of the textures that Mask Tools comes with, there's a selection of the seamless textures, and I want to select the seamless paint cracks texture. Now if I plug this into the erase mask input, you'll see that, well, something happens, but to make that a little more clear, let's add a mapping node and we'll scale this up to be quite a bit larger. Okay, and what that's done is it's removed everything except for the cracks, but we actually want to invert that. We want to keep everything except for the cracks. So if we come back over to the erase mask settings, you can see underneath of the input there's this invert erase mask slider. So now we've given that paint a nice aged, worn, cracked effect. And it's not only affecting the color, it's actually affecting the bump as well, so you get a little bit of extra shadow detail. Now all of this texture information in the first mask base node is now being transferred into the second mask base node. Okay, so I'm going to add this set of rough metal PBR textures. I'm just going to speed through this part because we've already done this a few times. Okay, and now I'll add a mapping node. And I'll just scale this up a little bit. So basically just double it. I'll set the values of X and Y to 2. Okay, and then I'll select all of these nodes and use Control G to put them into a group. And just to be consistent, I'll just label this one metal. And just as I did with the first mask base node, I need to add another mask texture. So I'll type Shift A, go to Texture, and then choose Image Texture. And I'll also just call this metal. This time, however, I'm going to double the resolution. So I'll set this to 2048 by 2048. And I also want to click this little checkbox, this 32-bit float, because this will actually have some bump and displacement information. And that 32-bit float will just help to give a better result. Now I'll scroll over to the next mask base node so that I can see these options while I'm painting. Now I'm going to adjust some settings. Here under the symmetry, I'm going to turn on all 3 axes, so X, Y, and Z. And under fall off, I'm going to switch back to the default, which has a much softer gradient along the edge. And under stroke, I'm going to switch from space to line. And instead of using the texture brush that I used before, I'm just going to delete that because I want that default round brush. And then finally, I'm just going to make sure that I'm painting on the correct texture. I'm also going to take the value down from white to a very light gray color in order to demonstrate what the mask blend does, specifically how it pertains to bump mapping. I can use the F key to change the size of my brush. And because I'm using the line method of drawing, you'll see if I click and drag, I'm creating this line, which can be used as a guide to draw straight edges. Now I'll just draw these borders along the front, the side, and the top of the model. And because we have the X, Y, and Z axes enabled in the symmetry, we're only doing half and it's being copied or mirrored onto the other side. Now, because we're painting this mask in a value of gray, it's not separated those two material types completely. They've blended, so the wood is blended now with that metal. but we can use the mask blend to separate them completely. This, however, does not affect the bump, so this will be more evident later once we start painting more bump detail. But what this allows you to do is separate all of those materials together, but still retain all of that bump information that we're painting. And again, once we start layering on different values of bump, you'll understand why that's necessary. Now, if we take a look at our 2D texture, we can see that we've just added this very light value on a texture that's a very dark value, and there's a slight gradient in between. And what we can do now in version 1.4, a new slider was added to the mask base node called add mask value. So once you turn that on, you'll see all of that value being added to that bump detail. It's a bit like a fake ambient occlusion, but it's very useful in kind of emphasizing height information. And to better illustrate why I painted that mask in a value of gray, I can do a quick demonstration to show why that might be useful. So I'll go to my front orthographic view, and what I want to do is I'll switch my value to white, completely white, and I'll just paint one stroke over top of that bump. So there's a very clear difference in the height information from that stroke than what I painted before. So you can basically layer different levels of bump height information over top of each other, which is extremely useful. And we'll do another example of this. I'm going to switch back to the space option and take my value down to an even darker gray this time. And so now I'll just draw this very simple shape. And this also gives me an opportunity to talk about another really fun way to paint with mask tools. So what I'll do is I'm going to switch to the smear brush, and then I'm going to select this fourth fall off. It's a very pointy brush. Now this will act very much like a sculpt brush, where you can just drag out these areas and create these custom shapes. And this is great for doing like ornamental work or some kind of like a decorative fine detail. It's just super easy to do. It feels very natural and fluent using the smear brush as opposed to trying to hand paint the detail. Okay, we'll just put one more of these little hooks down here and then move on. And so what I want to do now is I want to go back to painting the different levels of bump. So I'll go back to my paintbrush and I'll come down here to the color and I'll give this an even darker value of gray. And now if I paint on this, it's going to cut away another layer of that metal. So again, we're just using these values of gray or values of black and white to paint different levels of height. Even though I kind of like this little design, this pattern, I'm going to delete it by just painting over it with black, and that will erase everything that I've just done. Instead, I had planned on using some actual sculpt brushes to add this ornamental detail. So what I'll do is go back to the texture tab and open a new texture. And I already have a few of these sculpt brushes downloaded and saved into a folder. And these again are from textures.com. That has a huge selection of these kinds of sculpt brushes. So it's a very good resource for doing this kind of work. And I think most of these settings look good. The only thing that I want to change is under mapping in the texture dropdown. I'm going to switch this to stencil. And now when you do that, you see the stencil in the viewport, and you can just click and drag it over to the position where you want to paint. I also want to, because I don't want to use any of the black value of that texture, I'm going to switch the blend type to just add. So it's only adding the lightest value of this sculpt brush. I can hold Shift and use the right mouse button to scale this image down so that it fits really nicely into the corner. And I still have my symmetry on, so if I just paint in this one corner, it will add it to the others. And you can see this updating in the 2D texture as well. So I'll hit 7 on the number pad and go to the top view, and I'll just do the same thing. And then finally the side view. So now I have this, this pattern on all of the corners of this object. And now that that's done, I want to add just one more piece of ornamental detail to this object. So I'll go to my textures, open up a new texture, and I'll be using this one. And all of our settings here should be the same, except I want to take off the symmetry, because I only want this to appear on the front of the object. Okay, so we'll go to the front orthographic view, and then we'll scale this up so that it's rather large and try to get it as centered as possible. And then I'll just paint this detail on. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good, and we're nearly done and ready to bake our textures and use the displacement, but I'm going to go back to the smear brush because I want to talk about a few more things that you can do with it. I'm going to select that pointy fall off again. And you can actually use this to cut away at some of your bump detail as well. So I can make these little scratches that come through like edge wear or damaged areas. So this is dragging the bump through, but also because we're using the add mask value, we're dragging some dark value into it as well. And because we have this very straight edge where we drew our bump initially, we can actually use the smear brush to distort it and make it look worn and damaged. And again, it feels very much like sculpting. And while I won't go around the whole border and do this, it's a very cool effect if you want to take the time to really make that bump look interesting. I generally use this most often to reshape things that I've hand painted because when you're hand painting it's easy to make mistakes, but with this you can basically just reshape anything that you've drawn. Now we're ready to start adding some displacement to this model. So let's go back to the layout. And in order to view the displacement, we need to be in the Cycles render engine. So we'll switch to Cycles, and then we need to add a displacement node. So over at the material output, we'll type Shift A and go to Vector and choose Displacement. And I'll just plug that into the displacement on the material output. Now if I go into solid mode and I press Tab to go into edit mode, I can start adding more geometry. So first I'll use Control R to add a cut right down the middle, and then I'll just subdivide this, and I'm going to change the number of cuts up to 10, and then I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. I'll take the view up to 4, and if I go into my overlays and enable the wireframe, you can see just how dense the geometry is now. And this should be enough geometry to work with for displacement. I'll also shade this object smooth now, so we get nice smooth corners. Now if I go back into rendered view, you can see that that doesn't look very good. So let's make a few adjustments. The first thing to do is to plug the displacement output into the displacement node. And now that strength is very high, so we can take the scale way down. In fact, for the time being, I'm going to set it to 0 and then adjust some of my settings. You can use Control-Shift right-click to scroll down through all of the outputs on the mask-based node to view each map. So we have the colored, metallic, roughness, normal, and what I want is to take a look at the displacement. So if you remember, I didn't use a height map for the paint texture. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to borrow the displacement from the wood texture and plug it in. Now we'll still be getting a little height information from the bump of that paint, but the displacement is only going to use the wood plank height map. Now oftentimes when you download height maps, they vary pretty drastically in their range of value. And what you can do is underneath of the displacement inputs, you have these displacement value sliders. And what they're used for is basically to adjust the contrast of each individual height map. So you can just even out the value. This will make the displacement itself more even. And now finally we have a new slider on the mask base node called add mask to height. So if we slide that up, what it will do is it will add all of that detail that we painted from our mask to the height information. So now all of that cool ornamental detail will actually be displaced. Okay, so I think that our height map looks good now. So let's view our material through the principled shader. And we can take up the scale on the displacement node. And I think that that's looking pretty good. We can actually view this a little better if we add a Fresnel node. So if you type Shift A and go to Input, and then choose Fresnel. Now let's just add this to the viewer. It helps you see the curvature of all of that displacement and how it actually will look in the final result. And now we're ready to bake our textures. So I hear a lot of people talk about how they find baking in Blender intimidating, but it's really quite easy. The first thing that we'll do is we'll open up a image editor so that we can see the textures after we bake them. Now we need to add an empty image texture to the shader editor. So I'll type Shift A and go to Texture and choose Image Texture. Now we'll click New, and I'll just keep the resolution at 2048 by 2048. And I'll call this first texture Box Color and click OK. And Blender will bake anything that's plugged directly into a viewer node. So if I use Control-Shift right-click on the mask base node, it will add the material color to the viewer node. And because we're not baking any shadow detail, we can take the render all the way down to 1. And lastly, the most important thing is to make sure that that texture node is selected in the shader editor and your object is selected in the viewport. So if you come down to the Bake options, just click Bake, and in a few moments you'll have your color image texture. And then just make sure to save that texture somewhere. So now we can come back to the mask base node and Control-Shift click again to come to our metallic texture. And we'll just X this out and create a new one, and we'll call this one Box Metallic. And click OK, make sure that that texture is selected and your object is selected, and then we'll click Bake again. And again, we'll save this image as well. Okay, and next up is the roughness map, and Blender, the baking settings actually has an option for that. So if we view our model through the principled shader, we can come back to our bake settings and switch this from combined to roughness. Now we'll create a new texture here. We'll just X this one out, create new, and call this one Box Roughness. And click OK. Make sure that you select it. And then click Bake. And there's our roughness map, so we'll save this one. Now Blender also has an option for baking the normals, so we'll switch this from roughness to normal. And then again, X this texture out, create a new one, and we'll call it Box Normal. And when you bake normals this way, it's not just baking the normal maps, it's also baking any bump or height information that you have plugged in as well. So all of this detail, anything coming through the normal or the bump map will be baked. So we can just select our texture and then click bake. And then we have all that bump and normal detail. So we'll just save this image as well. And then finally, we need to bake the height map or displacement map. So we need to set this back to combined because Blender doesn't have an option for this. And we'll just scroll through the mask base until we get to our height map. Now we'll come back to our image texture and X this one out and create a new one and call this box displacement. You could make this texture a bit larger, but I'm just going to keep mine at that size. And this probably should not have used the 32-bit float for every texture that we just baked, but you do actually need it for the displacement one. So we'll just select this and then click bake. And then just make sure to save it. So really the process of baking is quite easy. It's not really as complicated as it seems. It's pretty repetitive, in fact. You're just doing the same thing for each kind of texture. But now I'm back in Eevee, so I'm just going to drag these textures in and plug them into the principled shader, and we'll get to see how this looks with the new displacement map in Eevee. And in order to view the displacement, we need to add a displacement modifier. So we'll come over to the modifiers and click Add Modifier, choose Displace, and then switch the coordinates to UV, and then we'll add the texture, box displacement, and the strength is very high, so we'll set the scale way down. Okay, that looks a lot better. Alright, so that's pretty much it. The last thing that we can do is we can decimate this so that it isn't so dense in geometry. So if you take a look at the wireframe, you can see just how much geometry is there. But if I set this down to about a 0.3, that should do a pretty good job of lowering the polygon count, but keeping all of that really good detail. So that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you are interested in mask tools, it's available now on the Blender market. I'll leave a link in the description below. Also, follow me on social media if you want to keep up to date on future releases and new features. So take care, guys. I'll see you in the next video.